All right. Well, welcome everyone. I'm happy to be here and have the opportunity to talk with you all today. My name's Jenny Case and I teach at UCA in the creative writing program. I teach a lot of creative nonfiction classes and then I also teach a lot of publishing classes. So intro to publishing for undergrads and then an editing and publishing class for MFA students. And in addition to that, when I was in college and then in grad school, I have a fair amount of experience in the publishing industry where I worked for some literary journals and academic presses, and I had an internship with a book publisher. So I'm coming here today and then in my teaching with some experience kind of behind the scenes. So I know what happens from the publisher's perspective and can help answer your questions there and make the process a little more familiar and hopefully a little less intimidating for you. So before I get into the content that I was going to go over today, I'd love to know what your publishing goals are so I can make sure and tailor our discussion to that. So let's just go around the room and if you could just quickly tell me what you like to write and what your dreams are as a writer. So what kind of publications are you hoping to gain in the future? So we can start here and then we'll circle clockwise.
Yeah, I write, well, it's sort of based on history, but a lot of it's fantasy and maybe a little comedy and some adventure stories and things.
Are you doing mostly short stories or books?
It's kind of, one's a series of books.
Okay.
And then there's like some of my father's memoirs and things, and I kind of jazzed it up a little bit.
Nice.
And some silly stuff my aunt and uncle did over the years. It's like, okay, those people need to be committed.
So you're looking at book publication?
Yeah, book, and then the little. But I've written. I wrote an opera, not the music. I wrote the libretto, the lyrics, and the dialogue and things. But I started off as an illustrator.
Okay.
And then I said, you know what? I can write stuff and illustrate my own darn stuff.
You're pretty well rounded there. Excellent. How about you?
My biggest interests are probably novellas, fantasy variety. Also, I want to do short stories, and I do have a couple, I call them monsters, novels, and then illustrating and publishing children's books is also.
Okay, great.
Well, I'm actually a self-publisher, but I do fantasy. We publish everything from short stories to novels.
Excellent.
And
Nice. You can help fill in the gaps on self-publishing then when we have questions. How about you?
I like to write fantasy, and I'm working on a novel.
Nice.
So it's a publication.
Well, this is the first time I've written. I have written a Christian devotional book, 365 days, and I've got a real copy of it. And I never thought I'd do anything like that, but I have.
Nice.
So I would say book publishing.
Yeah. Excellent. Good.
And I write fantasy, novel publishing specifically is what I'm interested in. And I especially would be interested in being able to do cross-genre publishing because I know that's difficult.
Yes. Good. All right, so we'll focus on kind of a general overview of the publishing industry so that you know what options are out there. And the main point about learning all of those options is so that you can approach publishing with a bit of a strategy, because there are a lot of publishers out there. There are a lot of different routes to publishing. Some are harder than others, some are more intimidating than others, some have more steps than others. So knowing that can help you start to think about your own projects and what route you want to take, so that once you have that final draft ready, you know the next step, or you can consider what you need to do with your manuscript to get it ready for the next step. So I'm going to hand out, I have 5 different types of publishers listed, and these, there are some kind of hybrid forms of publishers, so there is a lot of variety, but this is more or less the different routes to publishing that you can take. So the first one I have on there is journals, magazines, and online sites. So if you're writing short stories, or if you have poems or short pieces, or you wanted to publish a section of your novel and see if that could get published before you approach book publications, those are the sorts of publishing venues that you're going to want to approach. There are, of course, hundreds of them, right? So we could spend an entire hour talking about how to get into journals and magazines and online sites. And I'm happy to answer any questions you have later on once we can go over the sheet. But in general, you would go to the site that you're interested in being published on, and then you go to the About section, or sometimes it's called Submission Information, and just see what their approach to publishing is. The other, when we talk about book publishing, we have these 4 up here. So I have the big 5, which I mean the really big presses, all based in New York. There are 5 right now, but 2 are likely going to be merged soon, so pretty soon it's going to be 4, which is a little unfortunate for all of us writers, because the fewer big publishers there are, the more competitive it gets. So big publishers, you know, the New York Penguin, Random House, HarperCollins, those ones, it is really hard to get into, but there are those presses out there. The next one I have on here is independent presses. So those are going to be smaller presses than the big 5. Some of them are still quite big. So Milkweed Editions is a book publisher based in Minnesota. Counterpoint is a book publisher based in, I think they're in San Francisco, and both of those publish at least, you know, about 20 books a year, which feels big, but it's very different, right, from Penguin Random House, which is going to publish, I don't know. Do you know as a self-publisher what they publish? I haven't even counted. I think it's probably like, you know, 10,000 books a year. It's a lot of books. It's a lot of books. But there are a lot of independent presses, and we actually have some great independent presses here in Arkansas even. We have at Alia Press that Aaron Wood runs out of Little Rock. We have Sibling Rivalry Press that Seth and Brian, they're taking a break this year, but they run that out of Little Rock too. So there are lots of different kinds of independent presses. And if you're, for instance, interested in Christian, or you know, writing material for Christians, some of the big 5 presses do publish religious material, but there are also religious publishers, right? So you could think about them and approach them. Some of them are, you know, some reach very different kinds of audiences. So there are specific independent presses for fantasy, for science fiction, and these presses are great to look into as well. The next one is academic and scholarly presses, which I sense there's perhaps not a lot of interest in this room, so we can just touch on it, but this is good to keep in mind. Would be like the University of Arkansas Press, University of Georgia Press, University of Chicago Press, Harvard University Press. A lot of them, you know, most of the books they publish are for academics, so it's going to be pretty dry and dense if you're not, you know, an evolutionary biologist or something.
Yeah, my he taught chemistry at UCA before. He's submitted problems to some of these chemistry textbooks. It's like
Some of the academic presses are actually moving into doing own voices
Yes.
publishing, so
Yes.
if anybody wants to do that.
And if you write anything regional, you actually would be interested in looking at a university press, because most university presses have, it's called a list. They say their lists of books, the kinds of books they publish, and a lot of them have a trade section, trade meaning for the general public versus for other experts within that field. And they've kind of filled the gap recently that the conglomeration of New York-based presses has kind of kept people out. So more and more university presses are publishing cookbooks, regional children's books, memoirs, local history, so books for the public that have a regional focus that university press can reach. So those are good to consider too. And then the last one is hybrid and self-publishing. Hybrid publishing is a little different than self-publishing, but I put them in there. And I know the presentation next week is on self-publishing, so I'll only lightly touch on that, but it is a valuable approach to publishing too that's good to consider as you're thinking about your options and how to approach publication. So on the sheet, I explained the differences between these, right? So that it might be hard to know what one you want to approach and what they even do. So this sheet will give you a bit of an overview on it. But all of them publish books with the exception of the journal, but what those presses can do for you is very different. So the big five, or soon to be big four, those are the publishers that publish, the New York Times best-selling books. They're the publishers that can sometimes pay you in advance if you don't have a huge platform, as they call it, or you aren't well known. Sometimes it's smaller, so you might get $15,000 as an advance towards publication. But if you published a lot of books and they've sold well, that's where you do get six-figure advances, which I will never get, but they exist, right? So I'll cross my fingers for you all if that's your goal.
What do you think Michelle Obama got as an advance in hers?
Pretty large,
Okay.
yeah, because what's important to keep in mind with the big five is these are big companies that are profit-driven. So they want books that are going to sell. And if they think your book is going to sell, they'll be interested in it. So if it's a celebrity, right, someone that people know, someone whose lives people want to know about, they're going to be very interested in that book because lots of people are going to read it. They're going to get a lot of sales. They're less interested in books that they aren't convinced are going to have a national audience. And that's where getting into those presses can be difficult for us as emerging writers, and where those advances would be smaller. It's a business, right?
Remember the Joan Collins debacle though? They figured she was Jackie Collins' sister, and they fronted her $4 million to write a novel.
Yeah.
And she gave them a novel, and they thought it was terrible, and they took her to court. But the judge
Yeah.
said, she gave you a novel. You did not specify that it had to be something you loved to death.
You have
So
a contract.
she keeps
it's
the
a
money.
contract.
If
Yeah.
she'd not presented nothing, then you would have a case.
So they, when you're approaching the big five or thinking about the big five, they're great presses to be published by. It is hard to get in there, and it's because they are profit driven. They are interested in what will sell. So you really have to think about your project as sellable. Is this something that lots of people are going to sell? And then how can I frame it when I'm approaching agents that will make them realize this is a project that's going to sell? If you do get a contract with when you submit to the big five, you can't just send them your manuscript. They'll get it in their office and they'll recycle it without contacting you back. Instead, you have to get an agent. Who's heard of that lovely word, agent? Okay, about half of you. So an agent is, someone who has made it their career to find writers, to help them develop their manuscript, and then to represent that manuscript to those big publishers. So you would contact the agent, and you would usually do that by sending a query letter, which is a one-page cover letter that has a paragraph about your book project, a paragraph about you, and then sometimes they ask for about a 10-page sample. So you would send that to them via email. If they're interested, they'll respond. If they aren't, they might never respond. And eventually, after you cycle through 10, 50, 75, 100 agents, you might get one, right? And then they'll work with you on a book proposal. And once that's ready, they will send that book proposal to the editors they know at the imprints and all of those publishers in New York City. So it is a long process, and you would have to go through an agent first. At the bottom of the page, I have a list of resources. One of them is Poets and Writers. And on the Publish Your Writing tab, they do have a free list of agents. So if you're interested in seeking an agent, that's a place to start to at least get some names. Publishers Weekly also has a database, I believe, of agents, if you were interested in that. And I don't know if the library still gets the once-a-year book. Maybe not. They used to publish a list of contacts you could.
Well, there was a big, giant, thick book
Yeah.
they used to get. Now you get it on a CD-ROM.
Interesting. If you're big into social media, which I'm not, there is an agent thread on Twitter, and you can watch that thread, and agents will post things when they're seeking work. And that's a way also to help you know who's looking for submissions and who to reach out to. So you look for the agent, you send it, then they send it to the press, and then hopefully you get a great book contract, right? And if you do, that press will then help you with developmental editing, so they would say, cut this first chapter, we're starting here instead, we need to round out this character, right? So you thought your book was perfect and done, and then they're gonna make you work on it some more, but it'll be stronger, right? So they will guide you through developmental editing, and then they'll also help with copy editing. So they'll have a copy editor look at all your commas and semicolons and em dashes and make sure you did everything grammatically correct and the punctuation is where it needs to be. So they'll help with that. They'll design the book. You know, one of the drawbacks to the big 5 publishers is you lose control. You often don't get a say at all in what the cover of your book looks like or what font is chosen for the inside. They make those decisions because they choose a cover that they think will sell, right? A cover that if someone sees it at Kroger or Target or Walmart or Books A Million, that they'll pick it up. So they're thinking with sellability in mind versus artistry, which is sometimes where we as writers get a little hung up. Or we really want that artistic cover, right? That fits what we wanted to do with the book. And instead they have something abstract because it fits modern aesthetics, I don't know. But you do lose a little control, but they'll think carefully about it. And then they'll also work with you on publicity. So reaching out to bookstores, reaching out to book reviewers, things like that. One thing to keep in mind though, the big 5, right, you're working with companies that publish 10,000 books a year. You can have a great contract with Penguin Random House, but you might not be their favorite writer out of the 10,000 writers being published that year. So I know there are writers who have gotten great contracts, but then been disappointed because they didn't think their books got the same attention as Michelle Obama or some of the other big sellers.
You had ghostwriters right now.
Yeah. So there are pros and cons, right? You can earn a lot more money through the big 5. You can get a lot more publicity, right? Because the big 5, that's how you get into Barnes & Noble. That's how you get into Books A Million and, you know, at the airport, booksellers. So you can get a lot of sales, you can get a lot of publicity, but it is competitive and you lose some control. And that's where some of these others become a lot more interesting to writers. So independent publishers, there are all sorts of independent publishers. Some publish only poetry, you know, some publish Christian material, some publish health and food related material, some publish regional material or for particular audiences. So they have audiences in mind and markets in mind. They do, however, have much smaller budgets than those New York-based publishers. So in terms of advances, some you don't get in advance, but they'll say you get royalties, so 5% of every full price book that's sold, you'll get that. So hopefully it sells well enough and you'll accumulate some funds from that. Or they can give small advances. So based on what I know writers getting, general prose advances with independent presses can be between $2,000 and $25,000. Poetry is often zero because poetry is lovely, but it doesn't sell well, so they don't give you a lot of money up front. But some poems or some poetry collections, if you win a contest in particular, you might get $2,000 up front. Or if you're a well-known poet, they might give you $2,000 up front towards royalties. Independent presses will help with developmental editing, copy editing, design, and publicity, but the resources will vary, right? Some independent presses might have 2 full-page staff. Some might have 10 full-page staff. Some might have 2 volunteers, and it's just a work of the heart that they're doing. And based on their economics and their budget, that determines how much publicity they can afford for you and what they can do for your book. So if you're researching independent presses, you just want to be aware of that. What kind of resources do they have? How big are they? Do you recognize any of the other books? Do you like the look of their books? Have those books sold fairly well, etc. Their audience tends to be literary, topic specific, or regional. Independent presses will take work that's represented by an agent, but these are presses you can often submit to on your own. So you don't need an agent to submit to an independent press. Just go to their site and look up their submission guidelines. Some will want a sample, like a 10 to 20 page sample. Some have open reading periods, whether they invite full-length submissions, so you can send in your full manuscript and they'll look at it. So you'll just want to watch for that. The next one then is academic and scholarly presses. So we'll skip the academic part of that, but since they do publish some trade books, regional memoirs, regional fiction, cookbooks, children's books, local history, they're worth talking about. They have a lot of resources, but they often have a little less funding than some independent presses. So up front, you often will not get an advance with the academic press. The University of Arkansas Press won't give you an advance if you sign a book contract, but you will get that book contract, right? And you'll get royalties, so you'll get about 5% or so of what the book sells for. They don't often do a lot of developmental editing. Scholarly presses aren't known for that, so they won't work intensively with you on reworking the manuscript or editing it. So you'll want to make sure you're pretty happy with what you have when you submit to them. But they do copy edit, so they will make sure your punctuation is what it needs to be. They'll design it, and they can work towards some publicity. Their expertise, of course, is with academic publishing, but they are pretty, well ingrained in their regional communities. So University of Arkansas Press, will make sure that you have a presence at, what's it called now, the Seven Bridges Book Festival in Little Rock, and get you to some of those locations, so they can do things there. They are regional though, right? University of Arkansas Press is interested in work that will be read by people in Arkansas, or will be interesting to people in Arkansas. They're not going to, publish something that's about California or Washington. Instead, you want to look at the University of California Press or the University of Washington Press and find the press that's good for you. But they are looking more for memoir, even some fiction. So if you have something that's place-specific, that has a strong place, a regional thread, that's worth looking
Like my
into.
dad's memoir.
Yeah, like your dad's
That's him
memoir.
growing up on the farm in Stuttgart and in his war years.
Mhm. Yeah, so that would be worth looking into. Or if you're thinking, we have a few children's books, right? Children's book authors. If your book is very much about being in the South or being in Arkansas, they might be a lot more interested in your book than Penguin Random House. And they might be able to market it better to bookstores in Arkansas than Penguin Random House. Same with independent presses. So it's worth looking into. To submit to an academic press, you just go to their website and look for submission guidelines, and they'll have it spelled out in a lot of detail. They often want, however, a book proposal, which means it's usually like an 8 to 10 to 40 page document, depending on what they want in it, that asks for a synopsis, so an overview of your book. They want you to describe the audience of your book, so you have to write a paragraph describing who this book is for, who's going to read it. You have to describe the market for the book, so give a solid paragraph describing why people will buy it or why there's a need for this memoir about this one person who's your family member, but they don't care it's your family member. They want to know why other people will be interested in your family member's experience. They'll ask for something called comparative titles. So what other books exist in the world that are similar, but not exactly the same, right? Similar to the book, so that they know that there is interest in this kind of book. Mm-hmm.
How would you know that? Would you have to do your own research?
Yeah, you would do your own research. So that's where you would go to the bookstore and look in the aisle where you want your book to appear and see what other books have been written on the topic, or do research on Amazon or online and just see what kinds of books have been written about this subject before. Or if you're writing fantasy, right, what other fantasy novels are similar that show there is interest in this particular kind of writing. So it might be your favorite writer, right? You could put your favorite writer down as a comparative title to show that this is their cousins, their book cousins. When thinking about comparative titles, you want to prove that your book will sell, but you don't want to overestimate your audience, right? So if you're writing your own personal memoir, don't compare it to Michelle Obama's memoir, right? You aren't Michelle Obama, probably, right? I'm sure everyone here is doing great things in their communities, but it won't mean anything to them to say, my book is like Michelle Obama's book. It will mean something to say, my book is like this book, which was also published by a university press and is about similar things, or this book, did really well and was well read, and I found out about it at my book club, and it's about living in the South during the 1960s or something like that. So find books that are relatively well known, but they don't have to be huge sellers, right? You actually sometimes don't want only New York Times bestselling authors on your comparative list of titles, especially if you're submitting to a scholarly press. And then they'll ask for an overview of your book, chapter by chapter sometimes, and a sample. So just look through, they have some great resources out there. Most university presses will give pretty detailed instructions on what they want in a book proposal, because they're often working with academics who, despite their titles, don't know how to write book proposals either. So they give very specific instructions, which will be helpful for you if you're approaching them. And then there's hybrid publishing and self-publishing. And the difference between those two is hybrid publishers, it will offer a little bit of assistance, at least, in terms of perhaps copy editing, perhaps design, perhaps publicity, but they aren't really heavy-handed. It's still you making the decisions, you providing the manuscript, and some do a little bit, but they don't require a submission. They're not saying, I'm not going to publish you. They're just going to say, if you help fund this book, we will guide you through the publishing process and help you get it out in the world. And then self-publishing is when it's on you. So you are designing the book, the cover, the interior design. You're doing your own copy editing, or you're paying someone to do your copy editing for you, or asking a favor of your, very detail-oriented babysitter, teenage daughter, or something like that. So copy editing and proofing, design, all of that. So the great thing about self-publishing is that you have a lot of control. So if you know what you want your cover to look like, you have control to design your cover that way if you're self-publishing. It's also a great option if you're already well connected with a lot of readers. So if you know how to reach the readers you want, that's a great route, because you'll get all the profits, right? You're not going through someone else. And that way you can create a direct connection with your readers. The con is you do have to do it all yourself, and you're not going to be able to get into Barnes & Noble or Books A Million. Those stores usually won't stock self-published books, so you're going to have to work a little harder on your end to find the buyers and connect with people who will read your book. I know, I just met this June, someone in Texas who self-publishes a series of historical fiction. And she loves it because she has full control over her books, and she's able to publish them exactly when she wants to publish them. She's not held to anyone else's timeline or a publisher's timeline, but she says it's basically a full-time job to market it if she wants to get a high enough income, right, from selling that book. She does have to work pretty hard, but she has worked hard through, websites, through advertising, Facebook ads. She says have helped her a lot, and she's worked hard to build a reputation within the historical fiction community. That it works well for her. So that's definitely, good to consider. Just knowing that, however, you do have to do a lot more of that work up front, especially with marketing. All right, so that's a lot. Right? That's a lot of material all at once. What questions do you have? Yes?
You didn't mention copyright. How do you get your copyright?
If you're working, well, all of these presses will pretty much take care of it for you. They're going to file the copyright for you with the Library of Congress. And for self-publishing, it just depends who you go through. So there are, and this is where I'm not an expert. Yes, you can answer that.
And the Library of Congress site has a link. If you're a self-publisher, it takes like 5 minutes.
So it's
But
not as
you have
intimidating.
to send them a physical copy of your book after it's published, or it negates the record.
Well, then how do you get, like in the front of the book, it's got copyright?
Well, if you've written and published it, it's copyrighted, you just don't have it registered anywhere, so you just put copyrighted, your name, year, and that covers that. But to get it registered, you go through the library.
So
You
you,
can publish your book without really already having the copyright.
The act of publishing it creates the copyright.
It's not like a patent where you have to go get it registered. Just publishing it gives you the copyright to it.
Okay, but you've already registered it.
you can register it.
It's separate. Registering it is separate from copyright.
The nice thing about writing is you own your artistic material, so you have the copyright automatically. When you do start publishing though, especially if you're reaching, I mean you could publish your own piece on a printer, right, and start selling it at self-publishing fairs or at local events. And
Before I started writing, I was copywriting my artwork too.
yeah,
It's a different division. You just write them a check.
Yeah.
Because I had somebody try to pass off a piece of my artwork as their own. It's like, excuse me, I have this little letter that tells the Library of Congress says this is mine.
if you self-publish, I'll save that for next week because they're going to be experts, whereas I'm not. But there are specific printers and online self-publishing companies that will also guide you through the process. Lightning Source, I think, was a big one, and Create Space, though they changed their name through Amazon, and that, so I know that shifted. So they will guide you through that process
So
too.
you also get one of those little numbers with little dashes.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
have to have that little
The
number.
barcode, yeah.
How many royalties do you usually make off the big five? Like I understand it probably varies, just like the advances do.
Yeah.
But once you meet your advance in sales, how many royalties? Do
I
you
mean,
get?
most first-time book publishers are crossing their fingers that they meet their advance, right? So they don't always make money past the advance. You hope so, but there's so much that determines how well your book will sell, right? And some of it is very outside of your control. You can do a lot of work as a writer to try and promote your book, but you know, for instance, last year, I know a lot of people who had books come out in April. No one was out at bookstores in April last year. All of the book festivals shut down or went online, but not very well, right? And their books just didn't sell that well. Also, that's a good question. The marketing industry moves really quickly in book publishing. So if you're publishing with a big press, your book is hot and it's new for about 5 months, and then they lose interest in it.
Sometimes the genre changes too. They go, oh, everybody was into this sci-fi stuff before. Now we're into this historical adventure stuff.
So it just varies, right? And it depends so much on current events, on how well connected you are, on what kind of reviews or publicity they'll put into the book, right? If they put a lot of publicity into the book and it's on, you know, Oprah's book club and you get to talk with Oprah, you go on PBS NewsHour, right? Chances are it'll sell well, but they don't do that with all 10,000 books. So it's a little tricky. I have a memoir that I published with an academic press, and I've gotten $200. So sometimes publishing, it's not always a moneymaker, right? It can be if you really put the effort into it. If you really put the effort into self-publishing, you can do pretty well. You can do much better self-publishing than I've done with a university press.
I got $250 and a free ticket to Miami for writing the
There you
opera.
go. There you go. So it varies a lot on the resources the publisher has, what's happening in the world, what kind of audience you want, right? So I have at the bottom of here questions you consider. And as you're thinking about moving from drafting and editing to publishing, it's a great opportunity just to sit down and really think through your goals for your book. And your goals are never right or wrong or good or bad, right? It's just, what are your goals for the book that you're writing? Who do you want to reach? Are you going to be happy if this is a book that gets out in your local community, right? And serves a smaller audience because that's who you're writing it for? That's going to determine which of these publishers you approach, right? If you're really interested in just your local community, you probably are going to look at self-publishing, or you're going to look at regional presses or very specific presses who can help you reach that audience. If you're, interested in reaching, people who love to cook, right? You've written this novel about food. Not everyone reads novels about food, right? So, but you could publish through a press that's good at marketing food literature, and your reach is probably going to be a little smaller, right? You're going to be reaching people who love to cook and who love to read about cooking, but it's good to know is that going to be success for you? Well then, make your decisions based on what's going to feel successful to you. If your goal is ending up on the New York bestsellers list, right? You're going to want to ignore these three and build some online credits and get your name in some literary journals and reach out to an agent, and then let that agent do the work of trying to get you into the big presses. None of those approaches are better or worse than the other, but they're just different goals. So you want to sit down and think about what kind of readers you hope to reach and how many readers do you hope to reach, what will feel successful for you, how much work are you willing to do to design and market the book, are you willing to put in the work, and are you in fact energized, right, by the idea of designing the book and tackling marketing and business and how to get your book out there, or are you happy that you wrote it and you want it to reach some readers, but you really don't want to have to deal with spreadsheets and all of that stuff, right? Then your approach is different. Then you might want an independent press, or you might want to try for a larger press. And then what are your goals for your work, and which type of publisher will best help you meet those goals, right? Do you want to become a name in the fantasy industry? That's a particular route. Do you want, to write this book that is going to help your church community, that's a different kind of goal. Or, my goal was to publish a book so that I can keep my job, right? So I wanted a book. I was okay if it wasn't necessarily a big publisher, as long as it was a publisher that UCA would say, okay, yep, we commend you on this publication, you can keep teaching here. So just know what your goals are, and let that guide you as you make decisions about who to approach.
Put Fabio on the cover.
When should you start querying? Do you wait till the book is completely done and you make the final edits? Do you start?
That's a good question. You want to, and there are different approaches, right? Some people start querying pretty early, because if you can get an agent, agents are interested in helping you develop a project. So if you get an agent early on, they can give you feedback on your drafts as they progress and help you develop, and maybe even say, that approach isn't going to work, but how about you consider this, right? So having an agent's advice early in the process can be really beneficial. So if you think your topic or your approach is really timely and exciting and would get the interest of an agent, even if you don't have a fully developed draft yet, it's worth trying. The challenge with agents is that once you send a query to them and they say no, you can't send another, right? So you can't send them one and say, please consider my book project. And they say no, and then 2 years later, you've completely rewritten it, but it's still the same title. They'll see that title and they'll say, oh, we considered this 2 years ago. No, and they aren't even going to read it. So if you do start querying agents early, I would say create a narrow list of agents. Try it out, send out 10 query letters and see what happens. And if you're getting some positive feedback, maybe keep going, but if you're getting no, maybe work on developing the draft. Agents get a lot of submissions, right? So they'll only respond if they think your project idea has potential and is sellable, and if it's pretty polished. So they're looking for 10 sample pages that will really grip you. So you want to make sure those sample pages at least are good. And if they're interested, they'll ask for a section of your manuscript, a partial manuscript, so maybe 50 to 75 pages, and then they'll read it and they'll get back to you. If they're still interested, they'll ask for the full manuscript. With fiction, you often need a full manuscript for them to send it to an editor. So you have to weigh that, right? When am I ready? It's okay to not know. It's okay to try out at different periods.
Are the sample pages like the first 10 pages? Is it just any 10 pages? First 10.
Yeah, they'll often ask for the first 10. And keep in mind too that agents make their living by selling your projects, right? Don't sign on with an agent who asks you to pay them up front. That's a scam. Agents get money when you sign a book contract. Then they'll get 15%. So that number actually can go down pretty quick, right? After the agent takes 15% of your advance, and after the federal government takes whatever percentage of your advance, that number is a lot smaller than it at first would seem. But agents are going to be interested in books that are going to sell, right? Because those are books that are going to get picked up by bigger presses. That means the agent will have a paycheck to feed themselves and pay for their rent or their mortgage, right? But you can try out agents. It's free, right? It's free to send an email. So you can easily try out agents and just see what happens. The advice I got was to try out 7 to 10 agents at a time. And then if you're getting nice no's or a couple of yeses, that means your query letter's pretty strong and you can keep sending it out. If you aren't getting any responses though, that means you probably should rework your query letter to kind of highlight what would make this sellable, or rework your 10 pages a little bit. Good question. Did that answer it?
Do you have any advice on someone who wants to publish cross-genre?
So tell me what you mean by cross-genre.
I mean publishing more than one book in different genres.
Yeah. What genres?
So all under the umbrella of fantasy, but like maybe some middle grade, some YA, and some adult, and like some high fantasy, some urban fantasy.
Yeah. And are you interested in bigger publishers or? So you would want to find an agent that would sell both middle grade, young adult, and adult. So find an agent who has experience and is interested in working across that spectrum. The challenge with writing to multiple age groups is that your reputation won't always transfer, right? So you write this great young adult novel, it sells pretty well. That doesn't mean editors are going to be interested in your adult novel. You will have proven yourself as a young adult novelist, so if you write another fantasy piece, you'll likely have a lot more, it'll be easier, right? You'll have a little more interest, but they're not necessarily going to, if you suddenly write a novel or a book of poems or some, a cookbook, they're like, I don't know. So it is a challenge, but if you find an agent who already has connections across those age ranges or across genres, right? An agent who works with fiction and nonfiction, or fiction and food literature, then they can help and they'll have the connections and they'll be able to guide you through that.
Not so much a question, but on agents, one way to find agents is to, authors always thank their agents in their books.
Yes.
So if there's somebody who has a book that you feel like is close to yours, you can look up their agent, go to their website, maybe, and see who at that agency is accepting submissions.
Yeah.
And you know that they already know your market.
Yeah.
And the other thing is be super careful to pay attention to their guidelines, because if you don't follow the rules, they won't even read your email. And one that a lot of people don't understand is most agents will say, when they ask for your 10 pages, they'll say put it in the body of the email, and some people will go, I'm going to be helpful and attach it. They have programs to reject any email that comes in with an attachment. So that's why they tell you to copy and paste your 10 pages in. So don't shoot yourself in the foot.
Another tip on finding agents is, we talked about Twitter a little bit. There's a specific hashtag on Twitter called manuscript wishlist, or MWL, that agents will use when they are actively looking for new books, and it will have key parts of what they're looking for. So it might be something like the genre, so like fantasy or sci-fi or horror. It might be like young female protagonist or something like that. They'll have parts of what they want to represent, and if you see one that matches your book, you can reach out to that agent and connect with them.
Also, writers on Twitter pretty much always put that agent in their description too. So like, if you really like, I don't know, if he's on Twitter, Neil Gaiman, if he still has an agent in his bio, you could go to his like
Yeah.
And when you're looking through your bookcase to see what agents your favorite writers have, also pay attention to what presses publish them, right? Especially if you are interested in a kind of a more eclectic field or a field that might have more independent presses, you can get the names of those presses. You know, so for Christian manuscript, right, you can look at the names of those books and that will guide you to some possible presses.
I also know if you're trying to break in but you're nervous about querying, or you feel like you're done but you're not sure if it's polished because you've never done this before, there's a thing called Pitch Wars.
Yes.
That I don't remember who puts it on, but it's like this independent coalition of professional authors, professional publishers, and everything. And what they do is they get professional authors or editors or people in the field to volunteer as mentors. And then people with unpublished manuscripts can submit those to a mentor who will pick one. And for the next few months, they help you like bear down and like get that diamond shine polish on it. And then at the end of that, they who are a established industry professional will represent you on Twitter to agents. They're like, I'm vouching for this new author. Come represent them. And I know for a fact, like multiple people get book deals every year out of Pitch Wars. And they also do smaller versions like Pit Mad, which is where anyone can go and use that hashtag on Twitter to pitch their book like in a tweet. So it's like you have to fit it in a tweet to pitch it. And they do that during certain days. It's on their website when they do those. So I know those are also really good if you feel like you're not sure how to reach out into the field.
Honestly, get on Twitter.
Yeah, get on Twitter. Twitter is for writers. Yeah.
Other questions?
To me, I thought the hard part was writing the book. Sounds to me like this is going to be a lot worse because I'm just a little bit overwhelmed.
Yeah, it is overwhelming. And there's always a different hard part, right? Because writing the book is hard, finding a publisher is hard. It takes stamina, right, and endurance, because you'll likely get some no's, and you'll just need to brace yourself and balance, paying attention to what these no's might mean in terms of potential revisions, but also just saying, there are so many editors out there, and reading is a subjective experience, right? We all like different kinds of things. So one editor might turn it down, but that doesn't mean it's bad. It just means that editor wasn't interested, or that editor had already read too many similar pieces in the last month, or the editor already signed a contract for a similar piece and isn't going to pick it up. But a different editor might. So you just need endurance, right? And to have belief in your project. And then after you get the book contract, then you have to think about publicity, right? What do I do to reach out to the people I know and to sell this book and appear? And that's its own thing too. So it's a never-ending education.
And if there's a specific part you feel unsure of, you can always Google like how to write a query letter, or any specific thing you feel like you don't know. You can just Google it, and there's tons of advice.
Here's my query letter right now.
Do you get feedback on your query? Query letters are important, right? It's one page. Don't go over a page. They want it to be short. But get feedback from other people before you send it out to make sure it's ready. So a trusted writing friend, right? Ask them to look over it. does this book seem like it will sell? Am I, describing my book in a way that makes it interesting and evocative and fascinating and enticing? Would you recommend changing it? Right.
Another thing, when you're dealing with agents and independent press, is know the difference between a blurb and a synopsis, especially if you're doing fiction. The blurb is what you put on the back of the book, trying to get people to read it. So you're not going to tell them how it ends. A synopsis, they are going to want to know how that book ends.
Thank you for saying that. I did not know they were different.
Other questions? Thank you so much for coming out. Hopefully you're not leaving too overwhelmed. Just keep the sheet, right? Let it sit for a while. And then, really spend some time looking at those questions to consider as you approach publication. And think about your goals, because that really is what will guide you and can help you eliminate some of these options and make the process at least a little more intimidating, or set you up for being happy with the results. You're welcome.
Can you
Thank
hire
you.
somebody to do this for you?
Yes, you can have somebody doing it for you.
Yes, you can. I mean, there are lots of freelancers out there who will do some of that work for you, who will read through your manuscript, help you craft a query letter, give you developmental edits. You have to pay for it, right? So you want to think about your budget and what you're willing to pay a freelancer to do for you, but there's lots of help